All right, so we have a panel, a distinguished panel here today, and they are, from my left, Sister Barbara Caballero, who's going to talk in particular about her days at Thomas Aquinas Elementary School. Is that the formal name? All right, and the associated buildings, one of which, the old convent was, which used to be salmon colored, and now it's being, someone's spending a lot of money on that building. I don't know what's does anyone know? No. Anyway, and of course, as you all probably know, the old school is now houses ARC and various other things, so it's still serving the community. So, Sister Barbara, and of course, Rose Chavez Boggs, and Patricia Clark Dorner, and Helen Chavez Peterson, and they'll all interweave a little bit of their personal stories into their talk, because after all, that's why they're here on this particular panel. So, without further ado, after each lady gives a talk about a different aspect of the history of the building and so forth, we will have room left if they obey my instructions to wrap it up. We'll see how that goes, but we theoretically will have time for questions. So, without further ado, who was up first? I think it is Pat. Patricia Clark Dorner.
Thank you, Mark. Now, I wasn't told that this was supposed to be about the history of the building. I thought we were just supposed to...
I'm doing the history of the building.
Oh, you are? Good. Oh. I was ready to sneak out. Okay. Well, according to Ida Ada Stork, the Clarks were the third American family to settle in the Ojai. Old Tom Clark was the first, buying his acreage in the upper Ojai, and he planted wheat. His sister married Tommy Thompson, and they were the next to arrive on the scene. As for the third sibling, Michael Hugh Clark, he was a ruined man. Cousin Howard Bald, did any of you know Howard Bald? He had a lot of great stories, and he was a cousin. He told me that none of Michael Hugh's children had ever seen him smile. I believe old Tom and Tommy Thompson found the place for Michael Hugh and Margaret Lynch Clark to live, still standing at 1884 Ojai Avenue. After my children were grown, I decided to research my great-grandfather and try to unravel his story. I found the date of his immigration to Wisconsin, the first state west of the Alleghenies to be settled by immigrants. I also found that with the start of the Civil War, Michael went to New York and signed up with the 7th New York Militia. He was anxious to serve his new country. He was captured and spent the duration of the war in the infamous Confederate prison, Andersonville. Again, back to the internet, where I found McKinley Cantor's Andersonville and found beyond a shadow of a doubt why my great-grandfather was a ruined man. Oh, you can't hear it? Should I speak?
No.
Oh, okay.
Hold the mic straight at your mouth.
Thank you. Is this better? Okay. I want to pretend it's not here, you see. One short nugget from the book. Captain Henry Wirz, commandant of the camp, was later tried and executed, quite unfairly, I believe, for war crimes. He had no food for his own men and was in no position to feed his prisoners. One of the most horrific tales, the prisoners would search through feces trying to find undigested nuggets of food. The camp was overcrowded to 4 times its capacity. There was little water, less food. During the war, 45,000 prisoners were received at Andersonville. Of these, 13,000 died while in the camp. And some, like my great-grandfather, lived, but his cousin Howard Bald told me he had forgotten how to smile. There must have been a smile or two not seen by Howard. Michael and Margaret Lynch Clark had 10 children. One of whom was my grandfather, Bob Clark. Did any of you know him? He was a forest ranger, stagecoach driver, during which time he met and married the lovely Alice Barnett, who had come west for her health. And later, he was Ventura County Sheriff before being appointed U.S. Marshal. Alice was a devout Catholic, and she raised all her children, well, almost all, to be the same. James E. Ned Clark, the fourth son, and my dad hoed weeds along the avenue when he was in high school. He worked his way through Stanford University, went to work for Shell Oil. Dad said he'd never live in New York, but they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. It was as executive vice president for exploration and production that he met the Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama, when he was just 7 years old, the Lama that is. And it was in working for Shell that he rose to the position of executive vice president, exploration and production. And it was in this position that he was able to buy the ranch from Tony Sarzotti in 1947, the ranch his 4 children live on today, except that my house just burned, so I'm not living there now. His retirement came about when the board of Royal Dutch Shell asked him to become president of Shell, but as he said, he didn't want his job to consist of the dog and pony show required of most top executives, so he retired and moved back to his beloved Rancho del Cielo. Dad never missed Mass, no matter where he traveled for Shell. Even when he was in high school, he made Mass every Sunday. He next worked his way through Stanford, then went to work for Shell as a manager of the Ventura field. We went to the earliest Mass on Sunday so that Dad would have as much time as possible to work on the ranch. And we always sat in the little alcove at the back of the chapel as Dad was dressed in work clothes so he could get right to work when we got home. Do you remember that little alcove? Yeah. I wish I could remember the name of the priest who fainted on the altar. Dad was over the communion rail before anyone else had time to react. Father said he had to finish saying Mass, so he sat in a chair and finished saying Mass. And Dad, in his Levi's work boots and Mackinac, stayed in the front pew in case he was needed. Another strong memory is of Patricia Ann Thompson, now Sister Patricia Ann, kneeling at the altar rail for the entire Mass. We didn't really see much of Ojai in those days beyond the chapel. Rose and her sister will be telling you their story of downtown Ojai. The only time we saw downtown Ojai was when we went to Mass on Sunday. And to get to Mass on Sunday during the rainy season, we had to figure the most efficient way to navigate the 3-mile-long mud road. It wasn't paved in those days. Getting off the hill wasn't too bad. Dad would fire up the cattle truck, Freddie Ford, and we would slip and slide. Oops. Of the downhill challenge, then more or less slide downhill, hanging onto sagebrush to stay on our feet. Those are not the good old days. To get home, we usually slosh the 3 miles up the unpaved road to home, again slipping and sliding all the way. Or if Mother was waiting for us, she'd take a flying leap of the first half of the uphill challenge, gunning old Bessie Buick, and off we'd roar, high centering halfway up, usually at the Big Bend. And then we would always have a tarp so that we could slide baby sister Leslie the rest of the way home. And if it started raining when we were at home, we'd start down the hill hanging onto sagebrush to stay on our feet. Dad would have a car from Shell waiting to take us to St. Catherine's. And I'll never forget when little sister Linda got in trouble with one of the sisters for having mud on her leg. Many years later, I read that the city of Ventura was going to turn the Ventura Cemetery into a kiddie play park. Do any of you remember that? Yeah, it was very upsetting. The powers that be ordered that the tombstones be gathered up and dumped in out-of-the-way places such as Hall Canyon, or grinding them up for roadbed, leaving the bodies in the ground. I gathered as many descendants as I could find, and we spoke individually for our allotted 3 minutes apiece to both the City Council and Parks and Recreation, but it made no difference. A few years later, I got a call from a gentleman, "Would you happen to know a Michael Hugh Clark?" And I said, I didn't know him, but he was my great-grandfather. Well, his tombstone is in my yard, and I want you to have it. Yeah, and it's on the ranch today. My picture had been in the paper playing the Celtic harp, and this kind gentleman made the connection between the Clark name and the harp carved on the tombstone. Of course, I thanked him profusely and offered to pay him for his trouble, but he declined. So I took a bottle of champagne and we celebrated. My picture had been in the paper playing my Celtic harp. Playing my Celtic harp, and this kind gentleman made the connection between the Clark name and the harp carved on the tombstone. I already told you that. Evidently, his sons had been searching through the abandoned tombstones and admired this particular tombstone and brought it home, fortunately for me. Today, that tombstone remains in place in the driveway circle in front of my former 5,500 square foot home, which burned to the ground in the Thomas fire. And I am living in my son's home in Ventura. Now, if there is a moral to this story, it escapes me. Fortunately, my son is a kind guy. I think that's about all I need to say. I give the other ladies a chance. But we've been in Ojai for a long, long time, and I'm adjusting to life in Ventura, but it's hard.
Thank you, Pat. Next up, Rose Boggs.
Hello, and welcome to our museum and Town Talk. 100 years? Wow, 100 years. And I've been here 91 of them. There was an established Catholic community before a church was built. There were 5 Catholic families living in the valley. Imagine, no electricity, no plumbing, dirt roads, awful. Fernando Tico was the first family that lived in the valley. We have a citizen named Susanna Arce, and if you ever get a chance to hear her story, it's worth listening to. And the families would get a priest whenever they could, from wherever they could, and Mass would be said at their ranch or in their home or outside or maybe even in the barn. They were lucky if they had Mass once a month. In 1903, Father Henry O'Reilly from Buenaventura Mission began saying Mass every other Sunday in the assembly hall of the grammar school in Ojai. Early in 1904, it became a mission of St. Sebastian's Parish in Santa Paula. Father Gerald Gay came to say Mass. In 1905, Father Thomas King built a small wooden chapel. His congregation consisted of 15 families and a number of seasonal migrant workers. Mr. Thomas Clark Sr. donated the land for the church. And my entire life, I've learned so much about the Clark family, doing so much for our community, our church, and Villanova, and other things I probably don't know about. But he was assisted by Father King in the building of later on he did this, a 3-room parish house. Unfortunately, in the winter, the house had a terrible smell. Because it was cheaper, they had used adobe bricks and dirt from an old cesspool. I remember having catechism in the old building with dirt floors. I do not remember any smell ever. Do you, Helen?
I don't remember going to catechism in the old.
Oh. Well, you're younger than I am. In 1943, Father Edwin Dickinson had the building torn down, and Mr. Benson, a contractor from Miners Oaks, did the work. Then he used the good bricks to build a duplex on Aliso Street, now a historical landmark for the city of Ojai. And did you know that the building where the museum is also registered as a national landmark? Next page. By 1906, a First Communion class, a Confirmation class, and the Altar Society were formed. Father King was replaced briefly by Father Henry O'Reilly and later by Father Eugene Sugrains, who traveled from San Gabriel Mission to offer Mass once a month. Then Father John O'Brien replaced Father Sugrains, and after 2 years, Father Emil Ela came, and that's probably the name you've heard the most spoken of, and so that would have made it around 1906 or 7. Ojai's first full-time priest and daily Mass began. However, under Father Ela's watch, the fire destroyed the church in 1917. So he began saying Mass in the Isis Theater, which is still here today and which is over 100 years old. They had a meeting in the Presbyterian Church to begin fundraising for a new church. They collected money at the meeting, but they also received donations from civic groups and, of course, the church congregation. The new church was built at a cost of $9,000. It was completely paid for by the time the Augustinians arrived in Ojai. Clarks had donated the land. Mr. Libby donated the wall. Mr. Libby didn't want to have any donation to the church because he didn't ever want to have anyone think that he was associated with the Catholic Church. But he was willing to give his money for the wall and possibly other things. Well, actually, the 1919 church, he hired Meade and Requa to design it. They were the architects. February 23rd, 1919, the church was dedicated by Bishop Cantwell. Father Ela became the first pastor until 1922 when he was transferred back to Pennsylvania. Father Killian came, and he only was here for about 6 months and left because he was ill. Father Verhallen came, and he only lasted a short while, and he became ill. And in 1923, Father John McClare became the pastor. Do you think that the cesspool, that awful bricks, had something to do with their illness? So Bishop Cantwell gave the direction of St. Thomas Parish to the care of the Augustinians. And by this time, Villanova was beginning to come in place. And like I said, the Clarks were big sponsors of that, too. In late November 1923, Father Howard, he became the 5th pastor in less than 3 years. In 1958, Father Holland purchased the 10 acres in Miners Oaks to build a large church. However, Father Holland, I won't list the things that he accomplished throughout the United States before he came to Ojai, so he was in his later years. And they wanted to build a larger church in Miners Oaks. There were 700 families in the parish by then. But since Father Holland knew that he could not take on this big project, Father Blethen came to Ojai in 1961. Oh, I forgot to mention, before that, Father Rowan was here. Father Rowan was the priest that married my brother Dan in 1942 and my sister Nita in 1945. And Father Rowan was the one responsible for meeting with the parishioners to put in stained glass windows. And before the rectory was built, Father Rowan had meetings and conferences out at Villanova. And of course, he lived there too. So Father Holland, though, did get the new rectory built, and which is this one, and also the school in 1955, which Sister Barbara will tell you about. My family came in 1925. They had lived in Oxnard and were married in the Santa Clara Catholic Church. If you've never been there, you should go. It's a beautiful, beautiful church. And they lived there, and my mother had her first child, my oldest brother, Dan. And the doctor said, you know, you're really not the best health. You shouldn't have children. So she said, okay. And then she came back, and she had a second child, and he said, I thought I told you not to have any more children. So she had no more doctors. The family moved to Ojai, and both my mother and father needed a healthier environment. And so they moved to Ojai and had 4 more children. My brother Frank and my sister Maxine were born on Matilahaw Street in the little cottage that you can still see today behind the museum here. And then they moved to Lion Street, and I was born before there were doctors or hospitals. And of course, Maxine and Dan and Maxine and Frank had midwife. And then we moved to Lion Street, and I was born, and that was before doctors or hospitals. Then when Helen came along, they did have a doctor. And when we used to go to church in the little church, Maxine and I would sit there and look around, and we would just start giggling all the time. We giggled and giggled. I don't know why. I really don't remember. It may have been because we looked at the different hats, because in those days, every woman wore a hat to church. You had to dress up. None of this thongs and shorts and a T-shirt with a hole in it. And to this day, I wear a hat to church. Then I would remember the little church, the candles. They had a huge bank of small candles, and you could put a dime in there and ask for prayers for certain things. And when they built the big church, they took that out. And I don't know if it was because of fire, which might have been the reason, or because nobody wanted to clean up the mess it made. But I used to go with my mother to church and clean the pews, and she was very active in the Altar Society. Some of the families that I had, I remember the family names, but as a child, particularly in the 30s, I don't remember exactly what all they did. Florence Gavin came to Ojai, and I was told that she was a widow. She had a son, Austin, and a daughter, Patricia. And I found out later she actually was a teacher down at Santa Ana School, which is now under Lake Casitas. And she had not been a widow. But you know, in those days, you couldn't be seen and say that you were a divorce. And that's why I was told she was a widow, I think. Anyway, she was a lovely lady, and when it came time for my first communion, she bought me a brand new pair of shoes. I was so thrilled. And in later years, there were times when I did the same thing. I went to the rectory and left the secretary some money to buy someone shoes that needed it for their first communion. That was a very important time of our lives. Another person that came here to the small church was Loretta Young. She loved it dearly, and I think when the big church was built, the small church became, we called it a chapel, and I think she probably financially helped it keep going because it was difficult to have 2 places to worship.
What impressed me about Loretta Young was that she always wore a fur coat to church, and you could see fur coats.
Yes, the fur coat, yeah. And then the Zarzodi family did so much for Ojai, and the Aburo family, who were relatives of the Zarzodis, the Aburos, their son Bob became the big CEO of the Los Angeles Times for many years. There was the Rodriguez family that lived up the street from us, and they were a fairly large family. And also the Mercer family. I think we have Madge Mercer here, and I'm sure she could give a whole town talk on the Mercer family. And the Davy family lived up in Upper Ojai. They were a very large family. And Mary Davy was a wonderful salesperson. And if you saw her coming down the street, she probably had a whole roll of tickets to sell to some raffle or something. And I'm sure there's some Davies left around. It'd be nice to get some history from them. And then the Thompson and the Clark family. Another thing the Clark family did at Easter time, they had a big Easter egg hunt. They lived at the stone house just before San Antonio Creek out there on the right. A huge big yard with lots of nice grass or lawn, whatever it was. That was a big thing in my life every year, to go to the Easter egg hunt. Oh, I forgot to mention, there was also the Ramirez family that did a lot for things. Della was one of the ones that started the fiestas to make money. And another thing I wanted to tell you about our family is the school district told them not to speak Spanish to our children, to their 6 children. So I did not learn Spanish. Many people think that I probably did because I was one of the olive-skinned ones in the family. And if you try and speak Spanish to me, I can speak it, but it's pretty bad. And also another thing that wasn't, because kids called me Mexican, and I didn't know what that was. I was an American citizen, not a Mexican citizen. My mother never made tortillas. My father was a baker. He had worked for Bill Baker. He made bread. And we didn't live in a barrio. We did eat a lot of beans, which I love to this day. So anyway, I think that's about it for me. I asked...
Thank you, Rose. No, you're next to this.
Sister's next.
Well, okay, either way. Sister Barbara.
Good afternoon. Just in case you don't know, a lot of children and even grown-ups have security blankets. Well, I have my security doll right here, and she is known as the Sister Barbara doll. The original, I am the original. The doll is, the original doll has been donated to the museum by Mary Baker, which she convinced me to give it to her. But years ago, it was a loaner, but she ended up staying with it. And I just brought it along with me because she's my security, and she lives in my house. And she's been there for some years already. Just so you can have an idea of this is what I looked like when I was Sister Barbara. Right now, I'm called Sister Barbara, and when I was a sister, very close friends used to call me Barbara. I said, just don't call me Babs or Barbie. I detest that. So you can call me Barbara or Sister Barbara. I'll answer to both names. Just be kind to me. Now, Mary, you want to hold my doll? Sure. Mary Gwen and I go back a very long time. I taught her daughter in first grade, and I used to call her Penguin. And when she got married, I gave her a penguin as a gift with a little baby at her feet. And I also taught Rose's children, 2 of them, 2 of Pat's girls, and I did not get Helen's son because he was later. And I wasn't around anymore. But I see faces here of parishioners whose children went through my class and had to put up with me and I with them. Now, I will start by letting you know that the school began in Father Holland came to Ojai in 1950, and his dream, besides building the rectory and the parish hall and really bringing this parish into the life of a parish, he had this dream of building a school, and he wrote over 354 letters, much more or less about the age, the year that St. Thomas Aquinas was born. all the religious communities declined and said, sorry, Father, we cannot take a responsibility of a school. I don't know how the Sisters of Bethany exactly heard about this school and the idea anyway, and the Valley of Ojai. I don't think they had ever come here before. As a child, I used to come in the summer to the Mitsalaha Hot Springs, and we'd have swimming parties and barbecues, and then we'd go home. I used to think it was on the other side of the world. But he wanted the school so much that the sisters, I don't know, they didn't get a letter from Father. They heard about this valley and Father Holland and the school idea, and they came. Someone said, come and see. This reminds me of what Philip said to Nathaniel, come and see, so you can get to know who Jesus was. So they came one day, and what they saw was a wing that's on Aliso Street, and it was like, just imagine right here, this building here, it's just a shell from one wall to the other end to Cañada Street. Well, Sister Dolores, the superior, just stood there and leaned against the piece of construction material and said, I like it, we'll take it. And so the building was completed by the summer of '55. The sisters came to Ojai, and they lived on the corner of 112 West Aliso. That house is still there. And you mentioned Mrs. Gavin. Mrs. Gavin was very instrumental with helping Father Holland furnish the house so that it didn't look like a convent. It was just a home, but it had a lot of old, wonderful furniture that went with the environment and the building of the house. The sisters lived there for 3 years. Mrs. Gavin, who lived just a few blocks away from us, was a wonderful woman. She began to like the sisters very much. Being a teacher herself, she would call us her queridas, her dears. And there was one sister, the sister who did the cooking for us and some of the housekeeping, Sister Martha, became Mrs. Gavin's querida. Every time she came over, she'd go into the kitchen and visit with Sister Martha, and she would bring us her homemade marmalade, would bring us flowers, would bring us all kinds of things. I wasn't here yet, but I did get to know Mrs. Gavin. She was just a wonderful lady. We also called her querida, not to her face, but we spoke of her as that. She was always Mrs. Gavin to us. Mrs. Arnold, I don't know if you remember Nina Arnold. She was also very instrumental in furnishing the convent for us. Mrs. Salisbury and a few other women, they were called Father Holland's group, because they always helped him to do the things for the school and for the convent. He says, I don't know what to do. So he called on them, and when the convent was built, Father took the sisters to Los Angeles to, one of the big furniture stores in Los Angeles, and they bought the furniture for the convent, and the sisters were able to select what they wanted in the convent, so it looked like a convent. I came to Ojai in 1957. By that time, we already had 4 grades, and there were 5 of us teaching, and our sister that took care of the cooking for us and everything. Of course, she didn't do all the work. We did our own share of the work too, and I got to go into the kitchen and do my thing. We moved into the convent at 214 West Aliso, just across the street from the school. That convent is still there. You mentioned the convent. It's I think the owner that's there now is probably the 4th owner. When this convent sold, some partnership of some men from Hollywood were going to have some offices there, and they redid it. I went to see it. Then the night that they had their open house, the sign went up for sale. One of the partners backed out, and so that idea was forgotten. Then another company came in from an oil company from China or somewhere, but not here, and that they had it for a while as just business offices, and that also disappeared. But right now, the lady that owns the convent has invited me to go over and see what she is doing, because she said she wanted to bring it back more or less like it was original. But it's not that way. Now, I think what she decided she was going to do with it is make it into sort of a retreat center for Hindus or Muslims or whatever. And so the convent, when Anna and I went to visit, and we went into the chapel, because for me, it's always be the convent. That chapel will always be the chapel. When I go in there, I always feel the presence that the Lord is there. You know, I lived there for 32 years, so it's very important to me. She saw a statue of a Buddha, and she said, "That doesn't belong here." You know, so you got your answer of what happened to the convent. Like I said, the classes we began with only 2 sisters, and one of the families that came over for the first families to begin the school were the Thieves, Victor and Paula Thieves. They were in Playa del Rey the same year that the 2 sisters who came to Ojai were teaching, filling in for another community whose school was being built, and they rented 2 classrooms from another school, and so the sisters were teaching there. And Susan Thieves was in Sister Augustine's second grade. And they moved to Ojai that same summer. The sisters came that same summer, and they enrolled their children at St. Thomas, not knowing that they were going to have the same teachers all over again. So that was our first family, but we had the founding families of the first grade. I just want to mention a few of them. You might remember their names: A. Bates, Bunels, Fays, not Luenz, but Jack Fays, and McIntosh family, the Regan family, Torres family, and then I just remembered another one, which the Hagedorns. These children were all in the first grade, and when they graduated, it was in 1963. By that time, of course, we had 8 grades, and when I came, I started teaching 3rd grade. That's what I wanted to say. Sometimes my mind goes off somewhere else. When you get to be my age, you have those little problems once in a while. And the 3rd graders were wonderful. My very first day of teaching, I started on October 3rd, the Feast of St. Therese, who's my favorite saint. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I sat at the chair behind the desk, and I was just exhausted. I don't know if I had my head on the table or whatever, but the 2 sisters walked in and said, "How was your first day?" And I said, "Oh my, I'm so tired." I had 36 children, but that's not the point. That's not the big thing there. The following year, I was given a combination class of 3rd and 4th grade in a classroom about a third of the size of this maybe, and I had 70 children. And one of those was Lou Ann's niece, Kathy Fay. She went home that one afternoon, and she said to her mother, "Mom, I don't like being in the classroom there. Sister Barbara has me at the very end of the row, and I'm right against the closet. If you open the door, I can get in there." And Marge Fay told me what had happened. I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll put her near the front now." But I had 3rd and 4th grade, 36 and 36, or it was over 70 children. But I loved them, and we managed that year. We got through it. And I went on ahead a little here, but you wanted to talk to you about Father Holland. You mentioned to me that Father Holland struck you as someone a very interesting person. He was. He came to Ojai, and he wasn't well. He had a heart condition. They sent George Conley to help him. One evening, Father Conley said, "Father, can you please excuse me from finishing my evening office? I'm just tired." So Father said, "Go to bed, no problem." And that night, Father Conley just, right in one of the little rooms here, he just leaned over towards the wall and he died. And Father Holland told the sisters, I'm the one that was supposed to die, not him. He came to help me and keep me company, and now I'm all alone again. But then, like I was mentioning, Father Holland was a wonderful person. He was so grateful that the sisters accepted the school, and that there wasn't anything he wouldn't do for us. He had gotten the nickname from his fellow Augustinians of Cakey Holland, because he loved sweets. He liked donuts and cakes and cupcakes, and the doctor said, "Father, none of that. That's not good for your heart." And so he would bring us donuts and cookies and cake and ice cream. He enrolled us in a club of fruit of the month. So we would get oranges or apples or avocados, or then he'd go on trips and he'd mail us gifts. He'd bring us things. When when it was vacation time, we would go somewhere and he would give us his car. So we have a car that would really get us where we were going. He'd give us each some money so that we had something to spend. And that was taking care of us on all the material things. But as far as our spiritual life, we had daily mass at the convent. We had Sunday benediction. He got the priest from Santa Paula to come and give us the sacrament of confession every week. So we never missed anything as far as the spiritual life is concerned. And he just, like I said, there wasn't anything he wouldn't do for us. He was so grateful. He said, "Of all the letters I sent and all the calls I made, and you were the only ones that responded." And this Sister Dolores was from El Salvador, Sister Augustine from Los Angeles, and we weren't really, as far as I was concerned, I wasn't going to be a teacher in I didn't think I was going to get to the convent or become a teacher. I went to El Salvador to get my training, and then I was sent back to Ojai. So I started teaching maybe a month or less than a month after I made my first profession. At the same time, I was going to school. Thank God that we were allowed to teach and go to school at the same time. So I was, little by little, I finished my college education and continued teaching, and to this day, I am still working in the classroom. I'm going on my 62nd year of education in the Ojai Valley. I have taught some of your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Some of my students are now fellow teachers in the same school that I'm working. And my optometrist is her son, my little boy. I still call him my little boy. I can't call him doctor, I just say Michael. And so, like I'm saying, that we had a lot of activities. Our school was as normal as any other school, except we had something a little bit different. When Sister Dolores came from El Salvador, she was teaching. And the sisters had what we called in the school in El Salvador, we had a conduct card, and it was given to children every week, and so we did it here, and it was just to give the parents an idea of how their children were working during that week, and we had conduct, discipline, courtesy, and of course application. So we had numbers. It was a 10 was the highest you could get, 9 was good. If you got an 8, you were in trouble. All right, now, Father Holland would always take care of the students who got 8s. And he would call it jug. So he would say, "Okay, sisters, you go home, I'll take care of this." And so even first graders who got an 8 had to go to jug from 1st through 8th grade. Sometimes the first graders would fall asleep. And the 8th grader would say, "Father, he's asleep. Wake him up." And Father said, "Shut up and get to work." That's how he was. He tried to keep the kids, the students quiet, and was saying, "Quiet, please. Everybody quiet." Finally, he said he would just belt out, "Shut up," and that was silence. So he made, the first graders had to pay their punishment. But we didn't give them 8s very often. We even had one little boy who got an 8, and he was in first grade. He took the saliva and rubbed the 8 off. And he took it home to his mother, and this little boy happened to be the son of Dr. Stephen and Dorothy Chess. Well, she came to the convent with John in her hands and said, "I would like to speak with Sister St. John." And so Sister came out and said, "Sister, did you do this? Did you erase John's 8 and put a 9? She said, "No, I gave him an 8. "Okay, John." So he had consequences at school and at home. So even the ones that you think are the little saints are not the saints. And, one of the things that is something that's comical, our children, besides having all these other activities in the school, we had during Lent, our children would go to Mass every morning, and they also had on Stations of the Cross on Fridays. During the week, we take each group when we had for adoration, you might say a mini adoration, and they would have like the kindergartners maybe 10 minutes, go visit Jesus at the chapel, and we walk just down the street. And the children were responsible because we had the Holy Week services here in the church, so our altar servers were all students, and on Holy Thursday, at the end of the service, Father Carr told the altar servers, "Okay, we're going to take the Blessed Sacrament over to the convent because we can't leave the Blessed Sacrament here in the church." What happened was, it was dark. The boys in their surplices were all walking. About 2 to 4 boys were walking with Father, and Father was carrying the Blessed Sacrament. They had their candles lit and little bells ringing and the incense and all that. And all of a sudden, some dogs started barking and chasing them. So the boys dropped everything and ran. They left Father walking by himself, and they ran to the convent and waited for him over there. Well, when Father got there, he gave him a good scolding, and after he put the Blessed Sacrament away, he told the boys to bend over right there in the chapel, and they all bent over, and he took his belt and gave them a couple on the rear end. Well, that's how he kept them in line. Now, those altar boys in those days who always sat properly with their hands on their lap, and they, just like the Augustinians do or did, anyway, he had them well disciplined, and that was one thing we always remember what he did. And Father, I don't know, you remember Father David Ryan, who had his idea. He was always inventing something. He invented a computer out of an old TV screen and a typewriter, and he said he's going to teach the children the Morse code, the 7th and 8th graders, and whoever got it and passed the test was going to get a prize. Well, they worked at it, and they all got the test, and Father said, they said, "Father, who passed the test?" He said, "No one." No prize. No, well, he always did things like that, and then one year he also had, I don't know if you remember, your children were in the All Saints Day procession. He had the children, remember Carol, your little boy, Tommy came dressed as an Augustinian, and the priest, they loaned him a little cassock, black cassock from the altar servers, and the Augustinian's capuche, and so he looked like an Augustinian. And we had one boy at the end of the procession, and we were singing the Litany of the Saints in Latin, and this little boy, a descendant of the Camarillo family, Paul Rose came dressed as a gorilla. And we asked him, Paul, where is your costume as St. Paul? He said, this is it. This is before he was converted.
And on that note, thank you, Sister Barbara. Helen,
Helen, where are
just
you?
pass it over there. Do you need me to?
I'll hand them to you thank you for coming and letting me share the memories I have as a child, a young child, and when the stained glass windows first started being put into the chapel. I can't say all of the exact dates when they were put in, but the first one was put in was the Altar Society stained glass window. They're not actually stained glass windows. They are colored glass. Stained glass windows are painted glass. So this is the difference in that. It was St. Thomas of Aquinas, and each stained glass window had a caption underneath it like that, my bulletin board here, and then this was up over it. And you can see St. Thomas at the big church. It's in the choir area, the window of the choir area. So you can see that there. And that was donated by the Altar Society. That was the first window donated. The second window is St. Augustine, and it has much more of a story. St. Augustine window was donated by the Yaburo family. They had an older son, the oldest son, who was Larry, we called him Larry, or Lawrence. He graduated from Nordhoff in 1940 with my oldest sister. And he, right after they graduated from high school, he and two buddies decided to join General Chennault's Flying Tigers. And they took off for the war that was going on in Asia, but we were not involved yet. And one of the boys was John Rial, who was an Ojai boy, but he was not a Catholic. And the other one, I could not remember his name, and my sister Anita, before she passed, she couldn't remember who the third one was. But he may be alive out there someplace, I don't know. But Larry was the first one killed, the only one killed of the three boys. And so his parents donated the second window, which was St. Augustine, which the bottom and the top are there. And St. Augustine is in the right side off the altar in the children's chapel at St. Thomas. Then the next stained glass window is the one that is here in the museum. And it has this, I only have one picture, so I'll give it to him in just a minute. It was called Our Lady of Good Counsel. And when I was a little girl, I used to go with my mother when she would visit her friends. And Mrs. Brennan was her friend. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan had come to Ojai many, many years before. He was an electrician, and he is the one that first brought electricity to all the homes in Ojai. And it was very interesting. They came from New York, and he was Irish, and she was Jewish. And they came to Ojai, moved to Ojai because it was easier for their marriage than to live in New York. And so they came to Ojai, and he started the Brennan Electric Company and wired all the homes that were in Ojai because we only had like 500 people here when I was little. And they had a son who graduated from Nordhoff also. He graduated in 1937. Right after graduation, he left home and he went off and became a pilot. Now, back in those days, that meant he piloted biplanes. And he was gone, and his parents, of course, they had letters going back and forth, but somewhere between the year of 1937, when he graduated from Nordhoff and left town, to somewhere in there, 1942, 43, he was killed. His mother and father received notification from the government that he had died, and that was all they had. None of his belongings were sent to them, nothing, they knew nothing. And so Mrs. Brennan, of course, was very, very distraught and upset about it. And she was a dear friend of my mother, and when my mother would go visit Mrs. Brennan, I had to go along with her. And of course, that's the time, the era where there wasn't smartphones or stuff for little kids to play. I sat in the chair. There weren't even coloring books or magazines. I sat in the chair and did what the only thing I could do, and listened. And I listened to a lot. But Mrs. Brennan was so distraught and grieving, she wanted to do something. And this, I don't know if this was before Father Rowans said he wanted stained glass windows. I don't know if they discussed this before or if it was afterwards. But my mother said, well, why don't you give something to the church? And so Mrs. Brennan, on her own, started researching to have for a stained glass window. And she wrote, now this is before computers, she wrote letters to the glass factory in Chartres, France, and ordered our Mother of Good Counsel and had it in memory of her son. Well, Hitler marched into France in 1940, so we know France was occupied from 40 to 45. But the letter of the order of the stained glass window was discovered in the 50s. And that's when they honored the order of the window. And they made up the window, and they sent a craftsman with them, and the craftsman installed it where it is right now, up in the old choir loft here in the museum. And if you go at the end of the museum, where it used to be the altar, but it's now the diorama of the mountains and the wilderness and everything, and you look back up at the window, that's where the best perspective of the window is. Sometime during the 70s, people thought it was the hippies that did it. Somebody shot it, and so they put a plastic bulletproof out covering on the outside of it, so it couldn't be damaged again. I don't know if was repaired or not. I don't know. But that's the story of the stained glass window of James Brennan. And the other stained glass windows that we have the one the Thompson family gave, which is the Nativity. And that is as you enter the church, that one is on the right side as you go through the doors into the church. And that was commissioned by the Thompson family, and I don't know the story of why they did that. I think they just wanted to. The other one is the crucifixion, and that is on the left side of the door as you main aisle, and it was donated by a lady who was Mrs. McWhorter. She wasn't in Ojai very long, but she was very, very wealthy. And I remember going with my mother because she was a friend of my mother's. And I used to go and sit and listen to her talk. And one day she says, "Oh, Hortense," she says, "I just can't keep up with all these coupon clippings, all these coupon clippings." And I had no idea what she was talking about. I do now. And they weren't coupons for $1 off on Tide. So that is the story of the stained glass windows, as much as I know. We have one that is with the Mother of Good Counsel. This one, I believe this one, when it was removed from the church, it went to the Pattons. And I believe this one was donated by Mrs. Gavin. But there's no small window under it to tell if it was. These they have the small windows under them that will tell you who they were. Although on the crucifixion, they do not have a small window. But why Mrs. McWhorter gave it is she was from the age that her husband was on Wall Street, and about the time of Teapot Dome, or something like that is what I don't remember all the detail, but she used to tell my mother all these stories. And she said she was giving the stained glass window to the church because she hoped it would be his fire escape.
Thank you, Helen.